Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session of the LLF. Greetings to you wherever you may be in the world, and congratulations to the LLF for pulling off another wonderful festival despite these difficult circumstances. I'm deeply honored to have been invited to chair and moderate this session with two scholars whom I deeply admire. I imagine they met at Cambridge and have long and distinguished careers across great universities such as Harvard and Tufts. Authored both together and separately many notable books about imperial history, political economy, and the colonial and post-colonial struggles of both India and Pakistan. And of course, now the volume that we'll discuss today, this unique edition titled Oceanic Islam. I'm speaking, of course, about Professor Sugata Bose and Professor Ayesha Jalal. Welcome. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm going to begin with some slides of background on this topic that might be useful for the uninitiated into the topic. So let me just share screen. Silk Roads, the Indian Ocean, and the Future of World Order. And I want to emphasize, of course, at the outset that the Indian Ocean that you've taken on in this book is such a timely topic, not least for its historical reasons, but because it has indeed become the epicenter what we think of as 21st century geopolitics. Now, your book is, of course, about Oceanic Islam and the Indian Ocean more broadly in its role in history and some of the stories that have brought it to life over the centuries. But when most people speak about this phrase, Silk Roads, they do tend to think about the terrestrial domain and the terrestrial route. So this simple map here shows you the 11th and 12th century major routes linking Europe, the sort of West Asia, South Asia, East Asia, and indeed parts of North Africa as well. Those who are not necessarily experts on this subject would not recognize this map, but I know that our guest today would. And this is a famous map put together by the great sociologist Janet Abu-Lughod. And in her work, she highlighted what she called the major circuits of the 13th century world, particularly what we call the Middle Ages. And as you can see, the first, second, and third circuits are the ones we most often talk about. But in your book, you focus a lot on the oceanic, the maritime circuits that form the southern rim here. Again, it's remarkable how these maps reinforce the extent to which we had intra and inter-regional connectivity across these vast spaces going back a millennium and before. Now, one of the terms in that historical literature that I find most fascinating is Afro-Eurasia, right? A term that we use to refer to that pre-colonial world and the connectivity across these significant population and economic centers of that medieval era. And what we are witnessing today is very much the return of the Afro-Eurasian system. And it's not because of colonialism and the Cold War that we've been able to speak of that. But it is true today when we look at the activities of China's Belt and Road Initiative, as well as other interregional and bilateral investment and infrastructure related schemes. And of course, what you see here on this map is the vast majority of the human population across these geographies and the extent to which they are knitting themselves back together to be able to leverage economic and other kinds of complementarities is truly the greatest economic story of our times. Already you can see that many of these societies that we tend to refer to as quote unquote emerging markets, their volume of trade and with each other already exceeds their trade with the mature developed economies of Europe and of North America. And that's why many people speak of a new super cycle linking these regions together. So there's a lot of economic indicators to underpin these trends. For India, in particular, as a maritime historical and now future emergent power, this geography is very critical to their grand strategy. Over the last 25 years, India has pivoted in some ways from being thought of as a country that might attempt to rival or counterbalance China in terrestrial affairs of Eurasia to a country that's focused indeed much more on its historical, a more comfortable maritime role and investing very significantly in its navy. It has a look east policy towards Southeast Asia and far deeper engagement politically and commercially with countries of West Asia and of Africa as well. So this too is one of the key geopolitical stories of the last 4 or 5 years, and certainly the next 5 to 10 years. Looking at how that's complemented, and I would add that the term Indo-Pacific, which has now been picked up by Western strategists and even the Pentagon, which has renamed its command from Pacific Command to Indo-Pacific Command, is a reflection of the priorities of countries in the Indo-Pacific domain, particularly Japan and India, that actually together coined and developed this phrasing of the Indo-Pacific, which is a complement to the terrestrial activities going on. And what I just wanted to show you briefly here is a map that puts together many of the current investments in highways, railways, internet cables, oil and gas pipelines, and so forth, that are not only linking countries within Asia, but off to the west on the left side of the map to Europe as well. And this is, I believe, again, one of the big secular trends of our time. Whether or not a country is for or against the Belt and Road Initiative, or however the Pakistani situation with respect to this China-Pakistan economic corridor evolves, nonetheless, there is a significant gap between the supply end of infrastructure, finance, and provision when you're looking at the demographics and the economics of the societies inside this rectangle. And again, just to reiterate, inside this rectangle, there's a combined population of over 4 billion people. So roughly half or more of the human population lives inside this rectangle. So I do believe that process will unfold. It will be a tug of war to have ownership, control, and to profit from supply chains and infrastructure, but it is intimately part of this resurrection of the greater Indo-Pacific and maritime domain. Just to show you in economic terms how important this story is, and of course the origins that you explore in this book, Asia, the countries painted in orange, represent now in purchasing power parity terms about 50% of global GDP. Therefore, more than other regions. We don't have to debate now why measuring in PPP terms is more useful than not, but suffice it to say that at this point, given that Asian trade and financial integration exceeds its own connectivity with the rest of the world, PPP starts to matter more and more. Why is this important for those viewing this conversation from the West? Well, a lot of what's happening in terms of the growing gravity of Asia and the Indian Ocean explains some of the rifts that have come up in the transatlantic relationship. Really, all of us have grown up in a transatlantic era, and yet we are shifting very much into a Eurasian era and an Indian Ocean. And you can see how, in the case of Europe, for example, going back 5 years to its rejection of the overtures from the Obama administration, the pleas really from the Obama administration not to join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the Belt and Road Initiative, Europeans have moved forward in some collaboration with China anyway. Now we've also seen Europe move forward with its comprehensive agreement on investment with China. We've seen Europe move towards free trade agreements with Japan, ASEAN countries, and potentially opening them with India as well. So there is a real shift in the center of gravity, and it is really becoming a competition among North America and Europe to access Asian markets and to gain the upper hand in Asian markets. The final point really brings us back to the point, to the message about the system, the geographic systems, and the ways in which the rules of the future for this vast domain of societies across the greater Indian Ocean are starting to form their own rule books. And of the various circles in this Venn diagram, the one just to look at is the one on the left, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, founded by China. But with participation of roughly 100 countries, it's easily the fastest growing multilateral organization in history. And indeed, it contains many countries now that are completely non-contiguous to Asia at all. Places like Iceland, countries like Chile, have all become members of this organization. I think that's, again, evidence. So all of that is just a brief background into the contemporary significance of issues that are raised in your book. And I, of course, haven't touched on the deep cultural attributes that you cover so well in the book itself. And so with that, I actually want to jump into conversation and questions with you. The first question, of course, would be about the process of writing this book and your inspiration for having done so, for convening this volume, and even perhaps a word on the selection of scholars and voices that you've selected to be part of it. Would you care to comment on that to kick things off?
Yes, I mean it was. I mean the essays of in the volume were given at a conference by the name of I think it was Islam on the Indian Ocean Rim conference at Tufts University, where I teach, and the paper givers were selected. Not all papers that were given at the conference became part of this. I think we were concerned about the internal conversations that we wanted to see promoted within the volume, and so I think there is a conversation between the authors, which I think what makes a successful edited volume. So it is a conference volume which we have put out.
Now let me follow up with Sugata, would you like to comment on that as well?
No, I might add that each one of the contributors has a major monograph on Indian Ocean history, but we were able to distill some of their major insights into one volume in order to reach a wider readership. We wanted some of the conclusions to be read by those who are outside of the academy.
Mm-hmm. You've convincingly said that the historiography of the Indian Ocean and the history of Islam are two sides of the same coin and have been for centuries. And I think that's a very central and compelling message. Now, we know that Islam quickly reached Persia and Central Asia, India and Southeast Asia, particularly the latter regions, very much through maritime routes. So why did this story need to be told?
This was really an attempt to also question the foregrounding of port cities as opposed to hinterlands. And I think we wanted to show the connectivities between what are regions of Muslim majority in the subcontinent and the broader Indian Ocean arena, which I think was missing because the focus has been on port cities and the Indian Ocean. And concepts of universalism and cosmopolitanism, we felt needed to address areas where Muslims were in a majority in the subcontinent as well, and how they related to that Indian Ocean. So I think that's what was the primary interest in addressing the Indian Ocean in this way.
In your introductory remarks, Parag, you were talking about both terrestrial and oceanic connections. And one of the methodological contributions of this book, Oceanic Islam, is to show precisely how the Indian Ocean world was connected to the Asian continent. We took inspiration from Fernand Braudel, but also departed from some of his views. You see, when I wrote 100 Horizons, which Ayesha has just mentioned, I talked about the Indian Ocean as an interregional arena of human interaction. And there were readers who asked me that, does an interregional arena always necessarily have to be oceanic? My answer was no, there could in fact be overland connections. But just as Braudel showed how the Mediterranean world was linked to Europe through land isthmuses, so also Ayesha and I tried to show in this volume how the river isthmuses of the Indus and the Ganga and the Brahmaputra connected the Indian Ocean to the subcontinental landmass. And this, of course, led us to emphasize the Muslim majority regions of the Indus Valley and the Ganga Delta. And we were able to also make a contribution to environmental history, rivers and seas. And where we departed from Braudel was to say that geographic structures are not necessarily constants, that rivers constantly shift their course, and they can be quite sort of transient.
One of the things I particularly like about the methodology, the phrasing, and even the metaphor of rivers is that very often in the political geography, we think of rivers as dividers, right? They are considered natural political boundaries between states, and indeed many of the international boundaries in the world are rivers. However, rivers are also connectors. They are precisely the forces that allow empire and commerce and so forth to spread. And of course, the Danube and other major rivers systems are examples of that. If we can actually this circulation of people, I want to ask you about the role of the British Empire and the circulation of South Asian peoples across the Indo-Chinese geography back and to the Gulf countries as well as East Africa. So what role in particular did Muslims play, and from which countries or colonies of origin? And not only that story to recap for our viewers, so they understand how important that period was, but also crucially the legacies of that circulation of people for today.
Well, I think one of the things that I try to show is that the Muslims of India, amongst others, but particularly the Muslims of India, were able to use the British Empire, not just to sort of plot against it, as I think has been the emphasis in the historiography through pan-Islamic tendencies, but that there were certain kinds of intimacies that and working through the framework of the empire, people had relations. Arabia, for instance, were able to sort of interact in a way that we don't typically think of, because those were the kinds of intimacies that made the Indian Ocean arena a truly a global, I mean, a cultural interactive arena that Sugata mentioned earlier. So I think in that sense, and even Seema Alavi's paper showed how, contrary to what we think of the empire being an obstacle to interaction, despite all that it did to facilitate, i.e. through steam and print, interactions, that people were able to use it to their own advantage quite effectively. So it wasn't as if there was a cessation of the pre-colonial period interaction that, of course, has been very well documented, but that continued in the colonial era, and not just to plot against the colonial state. Eric shows very effectively the curbs that were imposed, the quarantine system that was imposed after the outbreak of cholera. But I think Seema's work is able to show the ways in which people were able to overcome those and use them to good effect. And I was able to show some of the more personalized intimacy. So I think it sort of really complicates the picture much more than a simple view that there was a great surge prior to the colonial state and then a sudden drop in interaction, despite the steam ships that made interaction much greater. Sugata, you might want to add to what I've just said.
Yes, there was a fairly strong focus on individuals in this volume. So if you read Ayesha's essay, which she has only mentioned in passing, she looks at the voyages of some of the very important Muslim intellectual figures across the Arabian Sea. Now they include, of course, Said Ahmad Khan and Shibli Nomani in the late 19th century. But what I found fascinating were her accounts of the travels of Muslims from Punjab, Mahbub Alam at the turn of the 20th century, Ghulam Rasul Meher later on, and of course also Muhammad Iqbal. And what we found in those journeys were some very fascinating intersections. Seema Alavi wrote about Rahmatullah Kairanvi, who fled to the Ottoman domains after the 1857 rebellion had been put down. But when Mahbub Alam went to Istanbul, he found that there were Ottoman scholars who were drawing on the works of Kairanvi. So these were, some of the fascinating links in the colonial era, in an age of rising, anti-colonial resistance against the British Empire. And also, if one looks at the links between what is today called South and Southeast Asia across the Bay of Bengal. There were connections of two very different kinds. Even though we shifted the focus away from ports and emporia to the river deltas, we also took into account smaller port cities. So if you look at Sunil Amrit's essay, he looks at the connection between Nagaur, which was the place where the main shrine to Shahul Hamid had been built, and from where he was able to do a comparative study of Tamil Muslims and Chinese Muslims in Southeast Asia. In fact, in your own city, Parag, Singapore, Ayesha and I visited just a few years ago the Shahul Hamid Shrine on Telokayar Street. So these were the kinds of connections. And of course, we also have two essays by Andrew Sartori and Iftekhar Iqbal on Bengal Muslims connections from the Ganga Brahmaputra Delta, also the Irrawaddy Delta of Burma, across Southeast Asia. So just as there was a movement of Tamil Muslims across the Bay of Bengal, alongside Tamils belonging to other religious communities, because large numbers of laborers moved in addition to capitalists from Tamil Nadu across the Bay of Bengal. So also, Bengal's history was not contained by the borders of that province. It spilled over to the entire domain of the Eastern Indian Ocean.
And I also think the Sana Iyer's piece very deftly shows the interconnections between, the early 20th century interconnections between Burma and the rest of India. So I think that's where and again, the role of the individuals comes in very strongly. So there is a consistency in all through the essays that we have in this volume.
Yes, in fact, today, there is a coup d'etat in Myanmar. I was just thinking of Burma, Rangoon, the capital, the Shwedagon, the main Buddhist temple. And yet, as Sana Iyer shows in the article in Oceanic Islam, there were pro-Khilafat movement gatherings inside the Shwedagon, and Buddhists and Muslims were together there during that Khilafat movement. And even a figure like Swami Shraddhanand from Punjab was speaking at gatherings of Muslims inside a Buddhist place of worship.
Now, in terms of legacy, the demographics are very plain to see today in terms of just by the numbers that Pakistan, India, Indonesia are the three most populous Muslim countries or largest Muslim populations in the world. Each of them, of course, embodying very different cultural and political forms or manifestations of Islam. Do you have an account of these different pathways that they have taken? Of course, that's far too big a question in and of itself. We know that the history of Islam in India now is different from and Pakistan's course, and of course Indonesia. But what I find interesting is to contrast how each of them deals doctrinally with today's channels of Islamic thought emanating from centers such as Saudi Arabia, for example. And so how does one think about the national course of Islamic evolution, if you will, in these three particular countries?
I think what we haven't mentioned, of course, is, that with the rise of the nation state, things have altered dramatically. And I think that has played a very key role in the way in which the dogma, if you like, or the political Islam has been transmitted across this interregional arena. So we're looking at an earlier period. We're looking at the period of colonial empire, which is really before the rise of the nation state. And we're looking at some of the alternatives that were available. One of the points that Sugata's been mentioning about the environment. The Gangetic Plain is one of the largest alluvium in the world, and that was sort of split apart, and new boundaries were created. And so that natural interconnectivity was in a sense disrupted. So that has to be factored in before you understand how Islam then is interpreted in a country like Pakistan as opposed to a country like India, or for that matter, what the Buddhist-Muslim relationship turns out to be with the rise of the Burmese state. So I think the nation state is a very important factor in the way, it's like a prism through which you have to see Islam being emanating from different areas of this Indian Ocean arena.
Sugata, would you like to add anything on that?
Yes, you know, Parag, if you read our introduction, you will see that we have a concluding paragraph where we talk about Ram Manohar Lohia and Jawaharlal Nehru visiting Mahatma Gandhi in Noakhali in 1946. And Ram Manohar Lohia writes that he was speaking to Nehru, who looked at the water and slime in East Bengal and said that this is something that he couldn't recognize coming from northern India. And Lohia thought that this was a startling thing to say, because surely the luxuriant terminus of the entire river system should be connected to its source. But once, you know, partition had entered the mindset of the leaders of the Indian National Congress, as Lohia put it, the geography of East Bengal could appear to be abominable. So what we say is that the partition, as it was brought about, you know, dividing up not just Punjab and Bengal, but the Indus Valley and the Ganga Delta, was a crime against nature and humanity for which we are still paying a very hefty price. You rightly pointed out a little while ago that rivers are meant to connect, but those river systems were divided and split up. Now, in the past, of course, if one looked simply at the Indonesian archipelago and South Asia, there was a certain difference. In Indonesia, most of the people formally converted to Islam, but many Hindu-Buddhist customs continued. In South Asia as a whole, Muslims were still in a minority, but there was a wonderful Islamic synthesis or an accommodation of cultural differences that had been worked out. Unfortunately, with the rise of nation states, some of these have come under threat, and particularly with the rise of Hindu religious majoritarianism in the Indian nation state, that wonderful cultural accommodation is under some serious threat right now.
I think one additional point I'd like to make, Parag, in response to your earlier question, is about pan-Islamism, or in today's contemporary world, we talk about Islamic fundamentalism or political Islam. I think one of the points that I try to make based on evidence that emerged, certainly people like Muhammad Iqbal and earlier Maulana Azad, who really about the use of political Islam or pan-Islamism, the linkages and connectivities that are sexual and cultural linkages that I think are underestimated, which I think still exist. I mean, if you really are trying to ask about the continuities with the present demographics of the Indian Ocean, I think those again do not get the same kind of emphasis as political Islam does. And I think that is again one of the sort of takeaways from this book, that these need to be accounted for. And I mean, they contested pan-Islamism and talked about Islamism or Islamic universalism, which they felt was not just political, but had a social and cultural dimension. And that interconnectivity amongst Muslims, I think, needs to be acknowledged as well.
I think of history as this additive set of layers rather than substituted. So, for example, when we're talking about the nation state, it is not that empire itself as a concept has been eradicated. We have the rise of China now, for example, not only as a territorial empire in Eastern Eurasia, but also as an aspirant maritime empire in its own way. And let's remember, of course, that the Belt and Road Initiative is designed to be equally terrestrial and maritime. Most people focus only on the former. So we have the nation state, we have an aspirant empire, and we have pan-Islam. So these three forces simultaneously, and parallel within all of that, there are, of course, the commercial connections and the common identities among merchants. So could you locate for us in your observations about the world today, how do you see actually the Islamic, pan-Islamic connectivity fitting into this multi-layered, multi-level, again, I would call it need of framework we are existing in right now?
Well, I think it's a question again of the preconceptions with which you go and find those interconnectivities. If the primary goal is to look for political Islam and the linkages, you're going to find those. I think that there is a tendency, I mean, and that is the reason why the contestation, I mean, why the objection to the use of the term pan-Islamism is important. I mean, two major figures complained or critiqued the use of the term pan-Islamism to describe the interconnectivities of Muslims across the Indian Ocean arena, preferring to emphasize the social and cultural dimensions. Today, those certainly exist, but how much attention are we paying in our everyday discussions to those connectivities? We are far more concerned with commerce. We're far more concerned with the movement of political ideas and terror. Let's not forget terror. So I think those have been given emphasis. And I think it's important to sort of see things in a broader perspective. And I think that's what the book is trying to do by foregrounding this period. So I mean, Sugata can certainly add to this. This is a long conversation on just the role of the of the nation state and what that has done to change things. Go ahead, Sugata. You want to add to this?
You know, Ayesha quotes Muhammad Iqbal in 1931, saying that the pan prefix is totally unnecessary before Islamism. And as we have shown in this volume, there had been no necessary contradiction, let's say, between Muslim universalism and Buddhist universalism when it was unconnected to the ideologies of modern post-colonial nation states. They could, you know, peacefully coexist side by side. But when, let us say, Buddhist majoritarianism became the state ideology of a Myanmar or a Sri Lanka, that's when, you know, problems arose. And the same can be said about the rise of Hindu majoritarianism and Muslim majoritarianism, where Hindus and Muslims happen to be in majorities. But I do want to add something about empires, which was part of your question. There were empires and empires. And even if you think about the Chinese empire, there was, as Wang Gangwu has shown, an earlier concept of Tiangxi. And there could be some older forms of tributary relations that were not as pernicious as the domination by Western colonial empires. For example, in my work, including 100 Horizons, I showed how the Mughal Empire and the Ottoman Empire had been very different in terms of their concepts of sovereignty and borders compared to the British colonial empire of the post-1857 period. And that's why the First World War was a revelation of a gulf. You know, that was the first Gulf War of the 20th century, but it really represented a conceptual gulf between the British Empire and the Ottoman Empire on the question of sovereignty and borders. Earlier empires could layer sovereignty and share sovereignty. Unfortunately, the British, French, Dutch colonial empires in South and Southeast Asia in the late 19th and early 20th century subscribed to unitary sovereignty. And it is a great tragedy that many nations which replaced these empires have subscribed to a unitary version of sovereignty, rather than the more enlightened, layered and shared concept of sovereignty that is part of the Indian Ocean and Asian heritage of political thought. So I think it's possible to think about relatively benign empires which know how to negotiate differences. And so we need to unlearn what the British Empire taught us and perhaps relearn, you know, some of the concepts that were in play in an earlier existing Chinese empire or a Mughal empire, and so on.
I'm so glad you raised this point. When we last met at Harvard, when I was presenting my Asia book, in that book, I was only allowed to spend one chapter on history, and I tried to condense about 4,000 years into one chapter. But the central lesson, indeed, that I raised was that Asian conceptions of empire have been more civilizational and allowed for that overlapping and fluidity, that the attributes, the late European imperial impositions of sovereignty have more or less made it far more difficult. And so it does require, precisely as you just put it, that Asians go back to a prior understanding of civilizational interactions if they're going to be able to find stability in a world where now sovereignty and borders have been baked into, if you will, the system. Which brings me to the point actually about Tianxia, which you cited the Chinese concept of its own centrality or self-understanding, if you will, and tributary model. Whereas it has been clearly demonstrated that in particular Chinese eras, Ming Dynasty, Qing Dynasty, there have been certain formulations and parameters of the tributary system. The geographies were quite limited. And now that China is pushing beyond into much further flung geographies, in which this notion, not only this notion of subservience, if you will, and tribute, is alien. It's certainly alien with respect to China. And it, of course, does not pay respect to the very possessive, if you will, and jealously guarded role that sovereignty plays in the post-colonial world, precisely because of the fragility of these newly created states. And I think that that is going to continue to be a point of tension. So it would almost be, we would be remiss to discuss the issue of the legacies of Oceanic Islam and the distribution of the Muslim population across Asia and across the Indian Ocean today, to not look at this tension potentially with Chinese understanding and its behavior towards Muslims and what that might mean in terms of how Islamism, I will remove the pan as a prefix, could become a sort of geopolitical force, and certainly not in the way that Samuel Huntington intended by any stretch of the imagination, not as a coherent geopolitical actor, but to what extent could it manifest itself in localized situations in light of, again, this overlap of empire, nation state, tensions over controlling commerce and trade routes, and Islam.
Yes, China, even though it was not formally colonized, as was India and many other parts of Southeast Asia, seem to have fought to be monolithic sovereignty, some of the rigid definition of borders that are borrowed entirely from the age of European empires. And of course, China's treatment of Muslim minorities has been shameful. There's absolutely no question about that. Now, how do we then recover these earlier conceptions? I'm at the moment writing another book, which is tentatively titled Asia After Europe. And in it, I actually discuss many of the ideas that were in circulation in the very early 20th century among South Asian and East Asian intellectuals. And they thought, including a man called Binoy Kumar Sharkar, who visited China in 1915, that this dream of China to form a strong, unified nation state, and he was talking about the Chinese Republic at that stage, is in some ways ill-conceived, that China, like South Asia, would be much better off with a federal idea, a federation of regions, allowing autonomy to its many constituent units, and thereby build a larger union. So all these ideas were in play even in the early 20th century, but which seem to have got swept aside after 1947 in South Asia and 1949 in China.
But I think this is a very good moment to try and retrieve some of those alternative ideas, because we live in a world where there is, whether we like it or not, growing acknowledgement that the relationship between the human and the non-human or the environment needs to be dramatically rethought. And I do think that part of the problem with the nation state and its adoption willy-nilly of colonial ideals was because of this perceived convenience of conquering and dominating nature. And I think that has to fundamentally change. And if that has to change, I think history becomes very relevant, because people did not necessarily have these ideas to the extent that the illusory power of the nation state has created, that we can simply build dams and go on building dams and divide, and that will be just fine. There'll be no sort of consequences. So I think that is where history comes in, and that's where the value of these ideas comes, whether we accept them or not. But I think we are in a really we are being pressed to consider.
It is in the Asian domain, just to pick up on your very interesting point, obviously very contemporary at the moment, but nonetheless, it is thus far Japan, based upon its very strong economic position and its technological innovation, that can speak about being a civilization, a power that can reduce its carbon emissions and attempt to, at least again as an island, be somewhat sustainable or even circular, to use the economic parlance. Xi Jinping has spoken very recently about the idea of an ecological civilization, and again moving towards carbon neutrality by 2060, which sounds like you and I would agree is a far too distant future to be of significance for the present generation. But we do not have a pan-Asian conception or common intellectual basis or appreciation, even if individual Asian societies have a legacy of drawing upon, or even in religious scripture, finding some harmony with nature. Of course, one finds this in Indian traditions as well. That said, when it comes to the actual task of the greater Indian Ocean region, where the resources are being consumed and transported, and the economies are growing so fast, and obviously the center of demography there is no pan-Asian governance in our environmental challenges today. And of course, this is not a question that makes particular reference to Islam. Clearly, the future of our region, whether it's Muslims in the region or non-Muslims in the region, hinges on whether or not there can be some degree of urgency applied to this issue. And I don't see much evidence of it beyond, again, these individual states. Do you see any way in which the cultural foundations that you've written about can play a more prominent role?
Do you want to answer that, Sugata? I think it can, and I think we are being pressed to do so. This pandemic, just take this pandemic. I think it's a watershed moment. And I think that we're short of ideas. You're absolutely right that there are no nobody's thinking about a pan-Asian governance or even sort of attitude towards nature that would be mutually beneficial. But I think the time has come for at least the intelligentsia and the younger generation to push for that. I think that's basically what it is. The states may well have to await the creation of a sentiment. And I think that it's becoming increasingly more pressing. Sugata, you might want to add to this.
Yes, just as we decided to use the phrase Muslim universalism in the subtitle of our book, Oceanic Islam. So also, I prefer to use the phrase Asian universalism instead of pan-Asianism. And that is because I think both religiously tinged universalisms as well as conceptions of Asian universalism may enable us to transcend some of the limitations of the modern post-colonial nation state. And what I would say is that the heyday of the post-colonial nation state actually lasted for about 40 years, from the late 1940s to the late 1980s. And then there was a period in the 1990s and the first decade of the 21st century when we were beginning to recover some of these older connections across Asia. But then in the last decade, there was the rise of majoritarianism and authoritarianism, just the revulsion against the worst features of globalization, which resulted in some kind of defensive nationalism. And so we were set back. But what I would say is that scholars and intellectuals have taken the lead in Asia to forge some of these Asian connections, which are absolutely essential, not just for environmental considerations, but much beyond, for the general peace and prosperity of the region as a whole. And political leaders, managers of states, I think, are running far behind, unfortunately. But there were visionary political leaders in the past as well. We in India were remembering a political leader who's almost forgotten, called Deshabandhu Chittaranjan Das, whose 150th birth anniversary it was last November. And he not only talked about a Hindu-Muslim pact in Bengal and India, but in his presidential address to the Indian National Congress in Gaya in 1922, he had evoked the vision of an Asiatic federation. And that was being echoed when my grandfather, Sharat Chandra Bose, visited Burma by Aung San, talking about an Asiatic federation in the not so distant future. Unfortunately, political leaders don't talk that language enough these days, but I think scholars and intellectuals have a role to play in taking the lead, in changing the discourse about Asian interconnectivity and also interconnectivity across the entire Indian Ocean interregional arena.
This bundle of concepts, whether it's Pan-Asianism, Asian universalism, or Asiatic federation, I think this is the kind of vocabulary that we do need to revive. Over the last 2 years, this is precisely the kind of message I've been sending in my travels around Asia. I will say that as much as there is now a natural inclination to embrace it to the extent that one is speaking to societies or interlocutors who are in countries that are confident in their own position, in their own identity, that they can think positively and constructively beyond the local insecurities that tend to animate, one will find a receptive audience. That said, fair warning, if we do use these terms, Asian universalism, I have encountered over the last 2 years quite significant suspicion and fear and alarmism outside of Asia. And so I can tell you firsthand that we will still have to contend with the concerns that the rise of Asia, as inexorable and inevitable as it is, necessarily entails the demise or the decline of the West, which it certainly does not. But that is often the way it's perceived, because some of these forces that you've mentioned around, again, parochialism and so forth, that have unfortunately plagued what could have been an Asiatic federation of the past, of course, as you know, have very much infected Western society. So they are not necessarily in the mindset to take on this. But that said, it's nonetheless a worthy mission for those of us Asians in Asia who not only appreciate the past, such as you've articulated it, but also see it as very, very necessary as a foundation for a stable Asia in the future. If we do have time, and this may be an unexpected question, but I do think it's very important to take Ayesha's very strong focus on the environmental question to its logical conclusion. And this, I'm also asking this because my next book is about the future of human geography. And I'm looking at the sudden and large scale kinds of population movements that we might expect in the coming decade or two. And of course, climate change is one factor, pandemic paranoia may be another, and so on and so forth. There's a range of drivers of human migration. One thing we do need to ask, therefore, is if we are confronting a worst case scenario around climate change, rising sea levels, droughts, temperature rise, desertification, erratic rainfall, all of these kinds of things. How do you feel that will play out across the Muslim world? What might we see in terms of population movements and transfers? And where might you see, despite the constrictions, of course, of the nation state, where might we see some degree of solidarity if indeed we are called upon to deal in ways that we're not prepared for with these urgent situations?
I think it's all about how you conceive the world. And I think if you're going to dismantle the presumptions and claims of Western universalisms, you do need to try and invoke the unities that have existed unbroken over the centuries, which is what we're trying to suggest. So it's not as if you have to rebuild the world from scratch. It's just that you have to think differently in order to find those commonalities and unities, whether it's in handling climate change or the movements of population. But I do think that the competitiveness, the almost dogmatic attitude with which the nation state has dealt with movements of peoples, you want commodities to move, but not people. These are the ones that have to be challenged by a much more nuanced understanding and a longer view of history. I mean, the presumption that what we have now is and therefore has to be and is the only way is where history comes to challenge you. That's what we've been doing.
In our introduction to Oceanic Islam, we have counterposed to Brodel's statement, Islam is the desert, our own counterclaim, Islam is the ocean. And, we could, if we are not wise, degenerate into water wars, for example.
That is a very optimistic note to end on, and a very tangible example of the inspirational effect that a book and a project like this can have. And we certainly all hope that the message does radiate universally, if you will. So Ayesha, Sugata, thank you so much for joining us, for sharing your time.
Thank you very much. Nice talking to you.